All right, in this video, we want to talk quickly about how to identify the sign of a trigonometric angle. Now, look at this angle. For instance, imagine you have sine of 25 degree. So the question remains, is this going to be a positive sign? Is the answer to this going to be a positive sign or a negative sign? So that's what we want to be investigating in this video. Situations like this, how do you know what particular sign an angle is going to have? All right, very quickly, let's check out our quadrant. Our quadrant is very important in solving this particular question. So let's see our quadrant, our basic quadrant. Our quadrant, we have it labeled as what you can see right here. There are different ways people tend to identify all these different letters. For instance, some people will say ACTS, that's hacked. Some other people will say CAST, cast. Now some other people will say all students take calculus. Some other people will say add sugar to coffee. So there are different ways. It depends on however you are able to process this that you can use to identify the letters in this particular quadrant where we have in front of us. Now I want you to understand each of these letters and what they actually mean. Now when we have A here, we're talking about all. That signifies all. When we have S here, we're talking about sine. And when we have T here, we're talking about the tangent of an angle. And when we have C here, we're talking about the cosine, the cos of an angle. All right, what does this all mean and how does this apply to what we're dealing with right here? Now, I want you to understand that the direction of this particular quadrant is actually anti-clockwise. That means we're moving like this. So we can say this, we can label this as the very first quadrant, this quadrant 1, this quadrant 2, this quadrant 3, and this quadrant 4. Now, how do you identify the angles of each of these quadrants? Well, for this quadrant, you can see right here that this is the first 90 degree. So what we have in this particular quadrant 1 is from 0 degree to 90 degree. And from here, we'll be dealing with 90 degree to 180 degree. And here we'll be dealing with 180 degree to 270 degree. And here we'll be dealing with 270 degree to 360 degree. So that's how we identify the angles on each of these quadrants. Now, what does this all mean when we talk about all sine, tan, and cosine? Well, the implication of this is that in this particular quadrant 1, all the trigonometry functions, that's sine, cos, and tangent, are all positive in this particular quadrant. So every trigonometry ratio or function is going to be positive if it lands in the first quadrant. Now, for this second quadrant, this implies that every other one apart from sine will be negative. That means the only positive you have here is the sine. So all you see here are the situations where you're going to be having a positive sign. So if your angle falls in quadrant 4, obviously you will be having if it's the cos of an angle, it will be having a positive sign if it falls in quadrant 4. But under quadrant 3, we have only the tangent being positive right there. And under the quadrant 2, we have only the sign being positive. So if you are to answer these particular questions we wrote here, where we have the sign of 25, obviously 25 degree falls in the first quadrant because this accommodates 0 to 90 degree. So you can see here, we have all being represented as being positive. So obviously, sine is also included as that which is positive in the first quadrant. So we can conclude right here that for this particular question, sine 25, our answer will be positive. So we'll be having plus something. We're not going to be focusing on the particular angle, but we're just focusing on the sign right here. Now, if you look at cos 147, in this case, 147 falls in the second quadrant. But in the second quadrant, we have only the sign being positive. So every other angle trigonometry ratio in this place is actually going to be negative. So that means cos 147, since it falls in the second quadrant, will obviously be giving me a negative answer. Now, in understanding quadrants, I also want to state some important things we have to know while understanding the quadrant in under trigonometry. For this particular question, for this particular quadrant, when we talk about hog, we say 0 to 90 degree. But under the second quadrant, there is a rule that happens right here. And that rule is 180 minus theta. So the rule that takes place, that takes place in the second quadrant is actually 180 minus theta. And when we're dealing with the third quadrant, we're dealing with 180 plus theta or theta plus 180. And that of the fourth quadrant, we're dealing with 360 minus theta. That's something that you have to take note of while understanding quadrants. All right, we have a question right here. And the question states that what quadrant is theta in if the first condition we have here is if the sine of an angle theta is less than 0 and the tangent of an angle theta is greater than 0. Now, before we go on to answering this question, I want to quickly identify something also that happens in this quadrant, which we have not talked about. Even though we identified all this as whole, sine, tan, and cos, I want you to know that right in this quadrant for sine, we also have another angle, another trigonometric ratio, which is the cosec, and which is the cosec theta, if you remember in our last video, is equals to 1 over sine theta. So we have cosec theta, often written as CSC, is 1 over sine of an angle. So in this case, we also have the cosec theta, the cosec being very positive in the second quadrant. And also for the tan, we also have the cot, that's the cotangent, which also cot theta is 1 over tan theta. And then for the cos theta, we can also see the sec theta being positive in this quadrant. So we have all being positive. For the second quadrant, we have sine and its reciprocal being positive. For the third quadrant, we have tan and its reciprocal being positive. Then for the cosine, which is the fourth quadrant, we have the reciprocal being positive. So let's delve right into solving this question. So we're trying to find a situation where we have our sign being negative. Let's have another quadrant here to examine this question. So our sign is negative and then our tan is positive, because when you say sine theta is less than 0, that means it's actually negative, and tan theta being greater than 0, that means it's actually positive. So let's first of all examine where do we have our sign being negative. Don't forget, our sign is positive in the first quadrant where all of them are positive, and also in the second quadrant where only sign is positive. So we know that right in the first and second, we have sign being positive. So obviously, to find out those that are negative, this is going to be the second, the third, and the fourth. So this is the second and the third and the fourth rather is where we're going to be having sign as being negative. So these are the two quadrants where sign is negative. Now for tan being positive, greater than 0, we know that we have the first and the third quadrant as the only two quadrants where tan is positive. So obviously, if we decide to shade where we have tan being positive, that's the first quadrant here, and also the third quadrant. So the answer to this particular question will be the third quadrant, because that's the only place where you have sign as negative and tan as positive. So this is the third quadrant. Now, let's try and examine that of question number B. So we have our cos being negative, cos theta being negative, less than 0. So we have to look for where cos is negative. We know that cos is actually positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 4. So this will obviously give us quadrant 2 and quadrant 3. Quadrant 2 and quadrant 3, 2 and 3 as the only quadrant that has cos as being negative. Then we have this stands for cosec, the cosecant of an angle. The cosecant of an angle is the reciprocal of the sine of an angle. And obviously, as I told you before, you're only going to be positive both in the first and also in the second, because it's also positive in the second. So we have it being positive because this is greater than 0. So it is positive in the first, where sine is also positive, and also positive in the second. So right here, we would have our second quadrant being the answer for this second question. So I have this question for you very quickly. I would love you to tell me what quadrant it is, in which theta, what quadrant is theta in, where we have the tan of an angle being less than 0 and the secant of an angle being greater than 0, and then also the sine of an angle being less than 0, and then the cot of an angle being greater than 0. So let me know your answer in the comment section on what quadrant we have this angle in. So guys, thank you very much for joining. I hope you have gained a lot. I hope you can be able to identify what sign a trigonometry angle is actually going to have. And I hope you have the proper understanding of the quadrant and all you need to know about it. I hope to see you in the next video. Thank you guys for joining. Bye-bye.